When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, the guns on Europe's battlefields finally fell silent. Cities smouldered, armies laid down their arms, and a continent braced itself for the immense task of rebuilding. Yet far from the ruined streets of Berlin and the shattered factories of the Reich, another battlefield still lingered, one hidden beneath the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic. There, in the last days of the war, more than 100 German U-boats continued to prowl in silence, unaware or unsure of what awaited them. For 6 years, these submarines had been the sharp spear point of Hitler's war at sea, threatening every Allied supply lane, challenging every convoy, and sending thousands of sailors to their graves. But now, as the Third Reich collapsed, their story approached its final chapter. On May 4th, 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the former commander of the U-boat arm and Hitler's designated successor, issued an order that would end one of the most intense campaigns in naval history. All German submarines were to cease hostilities immediately, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The message echoed across the Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay, the Arctic seas, and the Norwegian fjords. Men who had spent months underwater hunting in the darkness now faced an entirely different mission: survival, capitulation, and the uncertainty of what would come after. Across the ocean, U-boats began rising from the depths. Exhausted crews stepped onto their bridges, raising makeshift white flags as Allied aircraft circled overhead. Some submarines limped into harbour barely afloat, their hulls buckled from depth charge attacks, their engines failing after years of continuous deployment. Others surfaced in remote inlets where crews had anchored in hiding, hoping to wait out the end of the war. They steered toward ports such as Loch Eriboll in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, and Portland in southern England. For the Allies, each arrival signalled the quiet fall of the once feared Wolfpack fleet. The surrender process was methodical and tightly controlled. Royal Navy and US Navy boarding teams confiscated codebooks, charts, cryptographic devices, and weaponry. Engineers carefully catalogued each vessel, recording technical details, structural damage, and any hints of new design features. In Loch Eriboll alone, nearly 40 U-boats anchored together, a grim parade of steel that symbolized the end of a brutal undersea war. Some submarines never reached the designated ports at all. A few were scuttled by their crews to avoid capture. Others succumbed to mechanical failure. But by late May, the majority had fallen into Allied hands. The war beneath the Atlantic had been one of the most decisive campaigns of World War II. At its height, during 1940-1942, U-boats sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, threatening to sever Britain's lifeline and starve the island into submission. Germany's Wolfpack tactics, coordinated night attacks against convoys, nearly succeeded. Yet by 1943 the tide had turned dramatically. Allied radar, sonar, air patrols, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and advanced weapons like the Fido acoustic torpedo transformed the battlefield. In May 1943, Black May, the U-boat arm suffered catastrophic losses, forcing Admiral Dönitz to withdraw most submarines from the North Atlantic. Still, German engineers pressed forward with new designs, introducing the revolutionary Type 20 and Type 23 submarines, which promised greater underwater endurance and speed. These boats arrived too late to influence the war, but not too late to shape the future of naval warfare. With the final defeat of Germany, the Allies confronted a daunting question. What should be done with the world's largest and most technologically advanced submarine fleet? By the end of 1945, harbours across Britain overflowed with surrendered U-boats. Maintaining them was expensive, and storing them indefinitely made little strategic sense. Yet the Allies were well aware of the intelligence value hidden within these steel hulls. The Type 28 was sleek, streamlined, and designed to operate primarily underwater, represented a dramatic leap forward and would influence submarine development for decades. The Type 28 offered similar innovations on a smaller scale, ideal for coastal operations. For a brief moment, the direction of post-war naval power hung in the balance. To manage the captured fleet, the Allies formed the Tripartite Naval Commission in August 1945. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union each received 10 U-boats for evaluation, selected according to technological relevance and operational condition. Competition was fierce. The Western Allies hoped to prevent Germany's cutting-edge submarine technology from giving the Soviet Union a decisive advantage. The Soviets, recognizing the strategic importance of submarine warfare in the emerging Cold War, sought every scrap of German engineering they could acquire. Meanwhile, hundreds of captured German sailors languished in prison camps. Many were interrogated, especially engineers familiar with propulsion systems, battery technologies, and torpedo design. Others simply waited, uncertain of their fate. Only months later, with Germany divided between occupation zones, were most of them repatriated. At the same time, the British government made a decisive choice. The majority of the surrendered fleet would not be preserved. It would be destroyed. This decision became the blueprint for Operation Deadlight, one of the most extensive post-war scuttling operations ever undertaken. Between November 1945 and February 1946, the Royal Navy towed more than 100 U-boats into designated areas of the North Atlantic, codenamed XX, YY, and ZZ, approximately 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland. There, the submarines would be sunk by naval gunfire, explosive charges, or by simply opening their sea valves and allowing the ocean to flood in. The logistics were staggering. A total of 156 U-boats had surrendered to the Allies. Of these, 116 were earmarked for destruction. Many were in deplorable condition, rusted, leaking, and structurally unsound after years of warfare and months of neglect. Winter storms battered the towing vessels. Heavy seas caused tow cables to snap. Some submarines capsized or took on water long before reaching the dumping zones. In fact, more than a third, 56 submarines, sank prematurely during the process. The Royal Navy documented each loss but made no effort to salvage them. Deadlight's objective was complete elimination, not preservation. Those that reached the designated areas met varied ends. Some were shelled by destroyers until they rolled over and slipped beneath the surface. Others were used as target practice for aircraft firing rockets. A few were scuttled quietly, sinking slowly as water poured into their ballast tanks. One by one, the symbols of Hitler's undersea power disappeared beneath the waves. Among them was U-2336, the last U-boat to sink Allied ships during the war. It surrendered in June 1945 and was deliberately sunk off Ireland in January 1946. U-295 met a similar fate after being towed from Loch Ryan. The final submarine destroyed under Operation Deadlight was U-2511, a fully operational Type 28 that had sailed on its first war patrol mere days before the German surrender. It was scuttled on February 7, 1946, marking the end of a fleet that had once terrorized the Atlantic. Yet not every U-boat was destined for the seabed. A select few survived as prized trophies in the emerging Cold War. Britain conducted trials with U-3017, redesignated HMS N41, testing submerged endurance and hydrodynamic performance. Canada took possession of U-190, using it as a training platform before eventually sinking it during a ceremonial exercise. The United States studied several submarines intensively, dismantling some to analyze welding techniques, hull designs, snorkel systems, and battery capacities. At Portsmouth and New London naval bases, American engineers measured every aspect of German construction, using the findings to shape the next generation of US submarines. One of the most remarkable captures was U-234, intercepted on May 14, 1945, while en route to Japan. On board, the Americans discovered an astonishing cargo: jet engine components, technical documents, and nearly 560 kilograms of uranium oxide intended to support Japan's own weapons programs. The submarine's technological secrets and unusual payload provided invaluable intelligence. After being thoroughly examined, U-234 was eventually sunk in 1947 during weapons testing. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, used its allocation of U-boats as direct templates for the construction of the Whiskey-class submarines. Soviet engineers disassembled the captured boats piece by piece, reverse engineering every system. The snorkel technology, hydrodynamic hull shape, and battery improvements derived from German designs allowed the USSR to rapidly expand its submarine fleet, an alarming development for Western strategists who recognized the implications for the future balance of naval power. Other nations benefited as well. France incorporated several former U-boats into its rebuilt post-war navy. Norway operated captured submarines for coastal defense and training. Denmark integrated elements of German engineering into its shipbuilding programs. Through these transfers, the influence of the Kriegsmarine's final innovations rippled across Europe. By the late 1940s, however, even the preserved submarines had outlived their usefulness. Most were scrapped, sunk during exercises, or dismantled for parts. Yet their impact remained profound. The design principles of the Type 21, streamlined hulls, enlarged battery capacities, emphasis on submerged performance, became the cornerstone of nearly every conventional submarine built in the 1950s. In many ways, Germany's last wartime invention became the starting point for the submarine fleets of the nuclear age. Still, scattered across Europe and North America, a handful of U-boats survived to tell the story of an era. One of the most famous is U-995, which surrendered in Norway and later served in the Norwegian Navy before being returned to Germany. Today it rests at Labo, near Kiel, where visitors walk through its narrow corridors, experiencing firsthand the cramped environment where 45 men once lived and fought. Every steel plate, every bunk, every valve speaks to the harsh realities of submarine warfare. In France, U-123, renamed Blaison, served for several post-war years before being preserved in Lorient, once one of the Kriegsmarine's major U-boat bases. In Denmark, U-534 was raised from the Kattegat Strait in 1993, revealing remarkably intact compartments. It now stands in Birkenhead, England, cut into sections to display its internal machinery and living spaces. Across the Atlantic, the United States preserved U-505, captured intact in 1944 by a daring task force led by Captain Daniel Gallery. After serving as an intelligence treasure during the war, the submarine found a permanent home at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Today, it remains the only German U-boat on display in the Western Hemisphere, meticulously restored and visited by thousands every year. But while a handful of submarines became museum pieces, the vast majority remained where they fell during Operation Deadlight. For decades, these wrecks lay forgotten at the bottom of the Atlantic. Only in the early 2000s did maritime archaeologists, led by researcher Innes McCartney, begin mapping the site. Using sonar and deep-sea photography, his team identified dozens of wrecks, some remarkably intact, resting upright on the seabed as though waiting for one final patrol. Others lay broken, twisted by storms or wartime damage. Together they form one of the world's largest underwater graveyards, a silent testament to the end of Germany's submarine war. Yet the story of the U-boats is more than a military chronicle. It is a story of the men who served aboard them, men who endured claustrophobic conditions, constant danger, and the psychological toll of fighting in the depths. More than 30,000 German submariners died during the war, one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the armed forces. For Allied sailors, the threat of the U-boats shaped every convoy, every crossing, every night spent scanning the horizon for a periscope wake. Their legacy is complicated. To some, U-boats represent technological brilliance and tactical innovation. To others, they symbolize a relentless campaign that brought suffering to countless civilians and seamen. Today, the preserved submarines and the wrecks beneath the Atlantic stand as dual memorials, one accessible above water, one hidden in the deep. Together they remind us that beneath every strategic decision and every technical achievement lies a human cost. In the decades since World War II, the oceans have changed, and so has submarine warfare. Nuclear power, missile technology, and advanced sonar systems have reshaped the battlefield. Yet the fundamental principles pioneered by the final generation of German U-boats still echo in modern submarine design. Their influence persists in every navy that sails beneath the waves. As we look back on the final days of 1945, when defeated U-boats lined up in surrender, when tow lines strained in winter storms, and when explosions echoed across the North Atlantic during Operation Deadlight, we see more than the end of a fleet. We see the closing of a chapter in maritime history, an era defined by stealth, endurance, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. Today, the Atlantic holds their remains in cold silence. The steel hulls that once stalked convoys now rest on the ocean floor, slowly claimed by rust and marine life. Some are visited by divers, others remain untouched since the day they sank. But each serves as a reminder of a conflict fought not only on land and in the skies, but in the hidden world beneath the waves. The U-boat fleet, once the pride of Hitler's navy, is gone, but its story endures, etched into history, preserved in museums and remembered through those who served and those who suffered. The empire of steel that once challenged the world now lies quiet and still, suspended between history and the sea.